My name is Ian Lucas. I'm semi-retired. I used to be the Labour MP for Wrexham between 2001 and 2019. I've got a specific interest in disinformation because I was a member of the Select Committee in the House of Commons, which prepared 2 reports on disinformation and fake news between 2017 and 2019, and which educated me massively in this subject. Since I stood down in November of 2019, I've devoted most of my time to writing a book which is coming out in January called Digital Gangsters, which is about politics, disinformation, and the way that politics has been hugely influenced by disinformation. And I worked with Charles Kriel, and I worked with Kat in the past few years on this subject.
Thank you so much.
My name is Kyle Taylor. I'm the author of a book called The Little Black Book of Data and Democracy, which I'm been told to say there are copies of up here. I also run an organization in the UK called Fair Vote UK, and we published all the whistleblower evidence of Vote Leave's lawbreaking in the 2016 referendum. And I've since been working in civil society on comprehensive tech regulation, both in the UK, the EU, and the US. And so our focus is really on the online safety bill in the UK, the DSA in the EU, and whatever we might be able to get in the US to really regulate big tech to stop things like what you've just seen.
Well, and also you're our executive producer, don't forget.
Yes.
So Kyle's helped us enormously on this film. I'm Kat Gellin. I am the co-director along with Dr. Charles Kriel on the film Disinformed. And as Ian Lucas said, we've also, Charles worked with the committee and now works with Damien on the joint committee on the online harms bill. So.
Thank you. I'm Damien Collins. I'm a member of Parliament. I'm currently chairing the Joint Committee on the Draft Online Safety Bill. I previously chaired the Digital Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee during our inquiries on disinformation and fake news that Ian has mentioned. And that was how we used, and there was a clip at the beginning of the film of the first time we met Charles, actually, when he gave evidence to the committee. So that inquiry in 2018 covered disinformation and fake news on social media, but also the Cambridge Analytica scandal when that broke. And so I spent the last sort of 3-4 years of my life looking at these issues in terms of what the response should be, the public policy response should be to the challenges you've just seen so well outlined in the film.
Thank you all so much. Why don't we start with you, Kat, a little bit about the film and your experience of making it. What struck you most, particularly when you were speaking to and meeting different people who believe these online conspiracy theories?
I guess the first thing that struck me was this very central question of, you know, is it just that some people are stupid and some people are not? And of course, it's not that simple. So I started thinking about this film last year. Now Charles and I made this film, People You May Know, last year, which was largely about Damien's committee and the fallout from the Cambridge Analytica investigation. And a lot of people were asking us after that whether we were going to make another one. And I'm a yoga person myself. I've had a home birth. I've done all of these things. And last year I started to see so many people spreading this extreme sort of conspiracy online, especially in these communities that I've loved and been a part of for so long. So I thought this must be sort of the next step. And why are things overlapping between being skeptical of vaccinations and sort of the alternative health movement, and then suddenly sort of pulling it all the way into white nationalism and all of these really strange far right ideologies. So that's where it started.
Carl, I think you had some quite interesting insights into the kinds of people that believe this stuff, and it really struck me that anecdote you were giving about how the person who said, "Oh, I grew up in Ohio, and I felt like it must be more than that." How much of this do you think is about feeling and emotion, and how it perhaps doesn't align with science and facts? Or, you know, could you talk a little bit about that anecdote? Because I thought it was really interesting.
I mean, I think when we look at the last 10 years, the greatest innovation in how we exist among each other is the role of social media. And it was on hyperspeed in the COVID period when we were all stuck at home. And what we forget is using these tools actually changes the way we think, it changes the way we act, and it changes the way we interact with each other. And what's happened is we're no longer looking for information in one place and conversations and catch-ups with friends in another. They're all in the same place. And that emotion-driven environment means that we are socialized now to kind of ascribe our feelings about something to whether or not it's true. And that idea leads us into these places where we're looking for our communities. And as the film talks about, you're not just leaving like the belief that the earth is flat, you're leaving your friends, you're leaving your social ecosystem. There's so much more embedded in this, but it starts from this social media place. And the model of social media is keep people happy so they stay on, because the company's making money from selling ads. And for me, the principle is so simple and straightforward that this isn't as complex a problem as we believe, but the ultimate outcome is we are driven to we are made to feel that whatever we believe to be true is true because it's in the business's best interest. And so for me, that's the starting place of this. And it's like rocket fuel.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you next, Ian, kind of what responsibility you think the social media sites have for all of this, particularly having engaged in policy on this topic.
I think that confirmation bias is hugely important and is at the heart of why this is such a difficult problem for us to deal with. I mean, I've seen that, we saw that in the film with the anti-vax views. You see it in politics. And it's about communities as well, the way the communities have developed online, which reinforce particular perspectives in particular areas. And often those are hidden communities, particularly to people outside them. In democracy, that's hugely difficult because to deal with, because you end up with an enormous number of silos, which as a member of parliament, for example, are very difficult to move into, to even begin to argue or try to engage or hear or listen. It's firstly impossible to firstly know what's going on, but even more difficult is to try to persuade. So I think an organization like the BBC is massively important now, but in the present construct of society that we have, with the pace of the development of social media, I'm afraid it's being overtaken. And the thing that worries me most is that, you know, Damien and I did these reports in 2018 to 2019. In terms of legislation, nothing has changed. We're in exactly the same place. And we're continuing to have elections and also continuing to have these organizations operating within society without there being any societal response to them, which I think is why this film is so important and why the issue is so important.
Thank you. And Damien, to go on to the online safety bill, obviously that's something that you're discussing a lot right now in the committee you head up. Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, recently came to talk to you all. What have been your reflections, hearing evidence from her and others about this proposed online safety legislation here in the UK?
Well, I mean, Frances Haugen was crystal clear about the problem, which is that when you have an engagement-based business model, it can feed on people's anxieties. You know, if you're vulnerable, you're more likely to be served content and information that makes your vulnerabilities worse. You know, if you believe in a conspiracy theory, you know, you will see more of that conspiracy theory. You know, we had evidence not just from France, others saying, you know, the job of the algorithm is not just to try and find content that it thinks you'll like, it's to try and find the rabbit hole it can push you down, because that's a more effective way of holding your attention for longer. And like many addictive behaviors, sometimes people are engaged in things that are doing them a great deal of harm, but nevertheless, they feel compelled to continue with them. I thought, well, looking at one of the documents that Frances published, the document is well quoted, looking at Facebook research looking at teenage girls' use of Instagram and the heightened levels of depression and anxiety felt by the people in the study, there were two things that came out of that. Firstly, I think one of Facebook's talking points on that was, well, overall, the experience for people was positive, because only about 30% of people felt that way. So, that's a pretty big number when you scale it up across the whole platform. So who gets to decide what's enough depression and anxiety amongst teenage girls? Clearly, Facebook does, and they set their targets there. But the same research document said, almost like as an aside, well, but they still feel compelled to reuse the service, as if that's kind of like, that deals with the bit we would worry about, because if they were turning off the service because it was making them feel bad, then that would be a business problem. But because they're not anyway, we don't have to do very much about it. And this sense that engagement is the only metric for deciding whether the experience is positive or not. Because if you engage, you must like it, and therefore you keep on coming back. So I think what Francis really laid bare was the fact that within the companies, they experiment all the time on engagement, they understand the problems, they understand the risks, they understand the safety concerns, but they plow on anyway to keep engagement numbers high to make money. And I think the question that, relating back to the online safety bill, is we should have a right to know the basis on which these decisions are being made, the data and information that's being gathered. When things go wrong, what were the interventions the company could have made and didn't make? This sort of regulatory oversight is normal in most other big and complex industries. That kind of regulation builds in jeopardy for managers and executives about the decisions they make about the way their service is being used. It simply does not exist in the tech sector, and that is why we have the problems that we have today.
And can I just very quickly add, and a lot of this has come from this tech exception, right? Like tech started, Google was don't be evil, Facebook is connecting people. And we bought into this idea that these are more than companies, they're movements, they're transforming society. At the end of the day, they're for-profit businesses, right? And I use the example of their response to this. So that statistic Damien gave. In response, Facebook's own response, written by Nick Clegg, their head of global public affairs, he said, only 1% of teenage girls have suicidal thoughts from Instagram, as if that was a good thing. And so if we're talking about that's where their scale is, it's fine if 1% of teenage girls are having suicidal thoughts because of Instagram, that's within our operating margin of error, then we have to accept that their interests are not necessarily in society's interests.
And if you turn that across, let's say it's only 1% of Facebook users globally, active monthly users have that. That's only 29 million people. So, why should we know?
Well, big deal.
Exactly. So and I thought when you question the companies on this, it's amazing how they cannot say out loud things that they must know. So I asked Antigone Davis about the fact that
Facebook's head of safety.
Yeah, global head of safety, about the fact that she said Facebook doesn't amplify hate. And I said to her, I said, could you say that again, just to make sure I heard you correctly? So she repeated it. And I said, well, there was a study done, was well publicized. The Wall Street Journal had the story, it was publicized around the world, say that 60% of people on Facebook that joined groups that promoted extremist content did so at the platform's active recommendation. And she said she wasn't cited on that report. She couldn't say whether those numbers were correct or not. So we asked her, it was one of the Frances Haugen stories was the fact that Facebook engineers say that the AI only detects 5% of hate speech on the platform. She couldn't say whether that was true or not. She falls back on saying, well, our AI detects 98% of the content we remove, but how much do you remove of the hate speech that's there? Is that 98% of 3%? Or what is it? Can't say. And these are the people whose it's their day-to-day job to know this stuff. So there are two really worrying things about that. Do they really not know any of this, which is worrying if this is their business? I know they should be allowed to run it in such a cavalier way. Or do they know it's really that bad, but they just won't say out loud, in which case, well, we need to know that too, so we can make better decisions.
It's really striking because I think particularly as a reporter who covers this, I've spent a lot of time interviewing people who've come to harm, whose lives have been impacted. Most recently, I did a panorama investigation where we created a dummy troll account that showed how Facebook was promoting hateful content, anti-women content to this account. And so you feel like you're going a bit mad because you keep getting in touch with them, you ask for comment, they respond, often with similar responses. And you continue, and actually Haugen's testimony in particular has highlighted a lot of the issues that reporters covering disinformation, online abuse, social media have been raising through their journalism for a long time. It struck me that also you mentioned the Nick Clegg response, because he wrote that column where he said, you can't blame Facebook for all the bad things in the world. And I just wondered what you thought of that.
Well, I think it's a classic tactic in political speech, which is to try and create a relativity when you're talking about something absolute, right? So Nick Clegg tried to suggest that like these problems would exist without Facebook. And it's like, well, no one's having that argument. Our argument is, does Facebook play a role in these issues, and do they amplify them? And I think that what you see is just this classic attempt to create false equivalency. I mean, they themselves are their own source of disinformation.
Nick has done his political career doing that, though, by the way.
and I think that it's getting through the weeds, it's getting through the machine that is the challenge for governments, because they're taking on, just as a very quick statistic, in 2020, big tech spent more money than oil and gas and tobacco combined lobbying Washington, D.C., London, and Brussels. And that's what we are up against.
And the difficulty is they're being very successful because we haven't legislated. You know, our report came out three years ago, and we still haven't taken the steps that are necessary. Facebook, we found Facebook ducking and diving for 3 years when we were pursuing these issues on the committee. But what I learned was that they would not voluntarily give us the information. The problem is that there is no compulsion within any regulator or within any government that can obtain the information that we need, or that can compel the platforms to actually take action. So we have to start to put in place what Damien referred to, a regulatory system in the tech sector that exists in virtually every other industry that we deal with in our society. It's quite extraordinary that we allow what is probably the most influential industry in our country at the present time to operate really without any regulatory control.
And things slip under the radar as well. We saw the previous film that Charles and I made, People You May Know, last year. We went to America and saw that, in fact, Cambridge Analytica had collaborated with Christian churches, evangelical churches in the US, to radicalize people. And what happens is you have software companies who create bubbles for a trusted institution like the church, and they can track people, they can track donations, they can track children, they can track anything basically in a certain mile radius, and also people's vulnerabilities. So you have platforms being built entirely without people's knowledge, and you go and you put your data into the church you go to or any other trusted institution, who are then passing your data on to, say, political companies. And they have such a wide net with featuring things like mental health problems, featuring things like addiction, featuring things like grief, whether you've lost someone, and targeting you on that specific basis. And you have these vast nets that you haven't even thought about, but some software company somewhere has used all that data because it's out there.
There was in the film well, there are a couple of experts mentioned this, but where this disinformation is coming from, and it strikes me that the conversation, particularly since sort of 2016, has shifted from data to homegrown disinformation, and actually how your friend or your neighbor or someone is really susceptible to this stuff. What would you say, start with you, Kat, the profile of someone who is believing this stuff tends to be? What are the common attributes that you've seen through speaking to people?
Well, when we did the previous film, and also in this one, I've just used myself as an example. I lost my parents young, for example, and I would have been extremely susceptible to being pulled into a church, say, who would offer me to say, hey, are you lonely? Do you need this? I was somebody who was looking into home birth, so I would be extremely susceptible to someone saying, well, do you feel a little bit skeptical about this? Are you a little bit skeptical about that? Well, come and pay $499 a month, and I'll show you this brand new world. And it's just catching you in the moments where you're really vulnerable. You've just lost someone, you're about to have a baby, you've lost your job, you've been in military service, which means I mean, all of us have these vulnerabilities at some point or another. And that's what's so powerful. It means that it's not just, we'd like to think that, oh, I'd never fall for a conspiracy because, I'm educated, I'm smart, whatever. But the truth is, we all have this within us if you just catch you in the right moment. And especially now after the pandemic, sitting at home, trying to find the right information, being more vulnerable than usual, looking for community online. I think the scary thing is there's not one profile. There's just exploiting our vulnerabilities.
Does anyone else have anything they want?
I think the important issue for me is you only hear one side of the story. If you contact a group and that group presents you with a position online, it's very, very difficult to get another perspective to the one that's being presented to you. And you continue the whole time to go deeper into this tunnel of disinformation, which just reinforces the view that you had built from your first contact. And that continues. And that can happen in something like vaccinations. It can also happen in politics to reinforce a particular political viewpoint. And when it happens in those areas, it's really difficult to shift someone from that position if they're only obtaining information online.
I actually wanted to ask you, Mariana, unorthodox, as the moderator, but I know that you've been asking people, how, and this is the prime question, as Nina Yankovic says in the film, how do I get my family and friends out of this? And we talk a little bit about it, treating it as if someone's in a cult or just remaining a presence in their lives. And I wanted to ask you what you find in your reportings on this.
It's a really complex question, actually, because you find that often this just boils ultimately down to trust and who you trust and who you don't trust. And when you're trying to communicate with someone who believes online conspiracy theories or has become sucked into these quite dangerous communities on social media, trying to get them to begin to question that is crucial. And actually often just hitting them with evidence and fact isn't enough, because it's not really about that, or it's not just about that. And from interviewing, for example, family members of the son of one very popular conspiracy influencer here in the UK, or a woman who used to be an anti-vax activist who no longer is, quite similar to the woman who featured in your film, they all agreed that it was about questioning, and that it was important that that questioning came from somebody that person trusts. So being a family member, a friend, someone that they really respect is actually crucial, and you play a really important role. But the problem is that you can't expect that to change quickly, and it often will require conversation after conversation after conversation, because ultimately these people are victims themselves. They have fallen victim to online disinformation. They can then go on to spread further disinformation and cause harm, and others fall victim. And I think it's important to think of them as that, and that helps you think about the responsibility that other people, or rather the accountability of other people like social media sites or otherwise, which I kind of do a lot of through my reporting. So I think there's no kind of particular blueprint that you can use, but talking about it and trying to encourage them to reflect on and question what they're seeing online is at least a starting point, and to think about who they trust. There was a rally that I was covering for Panorama back almost a year ago now, and there was a man I was asking why he believed. He had a big placard that said Bill Gates is going to kill us all with the vaccine, and I asked him, why do you think this? And he was trying to explain the plot to me, and I said to him, I just don't really understand what Bill Gates would gain out of this. I don't really see why he'd do it. And that's often quite a good question, who benefits from this? And he said, well, you just clearly think that most people are good, and I think almost all people are bad. And when that distrust is that deep, it's very, very hard to even have a conversation about it, and all you can do is talk about it. There are other people another kind of good line of questioning can be to say to someone, they'll often, talk about these elaborate plots, which are worlds apart from political debates and medical discussions that people are having. And when they're talking about these plots, the amount of belief they have in governments and powerful people to orchestrate these incredible plans is just, you can't believe it. And if you say to them, do you think the government are credible, or do you trust the government, or do you think they're competent? They'll almost always say no. And then you go on to say, well, who's doing this then? There was a man I interviewed from the Netherlands yesterday who was involved in anti-vax protests, and the same thing. He said, it's the government and the people above the government. And I said, who are the people above the government? And he said, just go on the internet, you'll find it. That just tells you a lot about the mentality.
Well, it's
Yeah, I mean,
interesting once you start questioning people like Raymond Nichols, the chiropractor in the film. And once I started asking him about, do you trust this? Do you not trust the science of the vaccine, or what is it that you actually distrust? And when it came down to it, he said, well, it's the companies more than anything. And that's when you start getting justified skepticism of some things mixed in with then extreme disinformation. And then the sort of natural communities now very often overlap with this body sovereignty thing of that you can almost control disease by just being super healthy and having lots of vitamin D and eating vegan, then you'll just defy all of it. And it comes from, especially in the US, for-profit healthcare, all of these things where, and he says he comes from Mississippi, a very, very sick state in America who have a lot of problems. And you can see where the sort of justified viewpoint comes from, which makes it all the harder. In the case of the lockdown protester in Oslo, she was somebody that my impression of her was that she was quite lonely, and she was from a very small town up north in Norway. And she came down to the capital looking for friends, and she didn't have a job, and she went on Facebook, and Facebook quickly radicalized her. And to my impression, it was like, this could have been anything. It could have been any engagement, any activity, anywhere where you found a community, where you found friends, where you found somebody who engaged with you. And it happened to be, because of social media and Facebook and like a regulation, it just snapped you up, and gone she was. And that's what's really sad.
I just on the question of who, I do think it's important as well, like as several people were saying in the film, like that white supremacy plays a huge role in this. I mean, a huge role. And what you need is, and as we've said, like there is a root in reality to a lot of these issues. And what we've seen over the last 30 years is the greatest shift, a generational shift in equality and equity. And for the first time in places like the United States, you're seeing large swathes of the white population also suffering. And as they're suffering, the populists are using that opportunity to offer a simple solution to a complex problem. The simple solution is it's everyone else's fault. But because white people still retain most of the power in society, almost all of the power, they're seeing that as a way to then exert themselves. And social media adds the ability to connect and the rocket fuel behind it. So yes, there's always some reality into what people are feeling and thinking, but social media is giving the rocket fuel to people who already have power and are vulnerable to a populist who is rallying them around something that just isn't true.
Talking about the those on the far right, white supremacists, you also mentioned this idea of the circle, but there are people on the far left as well who have become very involved in these conspiracy movements. And it often strikes me at rallies that you see people who have totally opposed political opinions uniting together. And I wonder why you think that is. You mentioned that purity idea, purity of opinion.
Yeah, it's purity of thought, right? And in the United States, that the far left is also largely white, which I think is an important piece. But if you get too far enough around, you also have liberalism and authoritarianism. Far right, far left, ultimately they want some sense of authoritarianism. And so in terms of like why, what moves them, it is of course a distrust in institutions. But I think that when you get to that place of the far left where it's an absolutist view that is formed now largely through social media, because social media is an affirmation environment, right? Social media is a place that you go and everything is made just for you. I mean, think about that. There are 2.8 billion daily active users of Facebook's products, and every single Facebook feed is unique. It's just for you. There's no two feeds the same. And if you're socialized in an environment where you get used to everything being just for you, then you can't handle the idea that something isn't exactly what you want. So puritative politics is an extension of that. And I worked on the 2016 campaign in the United States, and you'd hear at the end people saying, oh, well, Hillary and Trump are basically the same. So since I can't get what I want, I'm not going to vote. And you're sort of going, democracy is all about compromise. Like the fundamental principle of democracy is you're usually getting the least worst option, right? You're usually going, okay, well, one of these people is going to be in charge. Which one do I want to be in charge slightly more than the other? But that purity is what defines the extremes, and the inability to deal with adversity and to deal with compromise drives people to a place that makes them non-negotiable.
Do you also think that there's a thing about misunderstanding some certain buzzwords, like being a Nazi, like fascism? Because I see this used by both the far left and the far right. And I see that, the far right uses it as a, of course, there was the National Socialist Party in Germany that then went on to become the Nazis. So they use that, oh, well, it's the far left, that they're the Nazis, they're the fascists. And then you see the far left going, well, now you're forcing us to vaccinate, to wear masks. So that's fascism. And then so everybody throws these buzzwords around that they don't really know the depth of, and they don't really know what they mean. And then perhaps in a rally, they can find that they maybe agree and go, yeah, fascism, something.
And it's like, sorry to Bogart.
That's right, we're running out of time.
It's libertarianism versus socialism as well, right? Like, why do we wear masks? To help everyone else. For a lot of people, that's not a reason to take action, to simply help other people. And so that's the other aspect of this. And that's why I really think thinking of it as a circle as opposed to a line is so important. Because if you actually ask someone, like, why don't you wear a mask? And they say, well, there's no health benefit to me. So that person's mindset is, I act only in ways that benefit me. And when we get to things like the National Health Service in the UK versus the privatized system in the US, right, which is so important in a pandemic, what we saw was that's what rallied people to action in the UK. The idea that the National Health Service would be overwhelmed. Not that I could infect you and then I'd be responsible for your infection and, oh my God, I'd feel terrible, but the actual system itself that is social. What do you do with that? I don't know. I mean, I think social media, again, incentivizes selfishness. So, we're looking at a system and an architecture that is bringing out the absolute worst in people.
I think that is all we've got time for. I was actually going to say that if there was a final thought, I guess, from just Damien and Ian, very, very quickly in one sentence, what you'd like to see happen next, because you are the former and current, politicians sitting here, and it's quite obvious that Pandora's box is wide open.
I think we need a reassertion of community as a whole. I think Protect the NHS was an attempt to do that in a national crisis, but I think that we need the structure from politicians like Damien put in place. Unfortunately, he's not in government, which is why this hasn't been done, put in place to help us construct community and rebuilding trust, which is a massive issue in politics.
Well, the Joint Committee on the Online Safety Bill will report before Christmas. That will set out the regulatory structure that we will need, and then we'll legislate on in the next year, and we'll be the first country in the world to do that in a comprehensive way. And I think we can lead in this debate, but we are going to need to. I think what will take time is to undo the damage. I think we can start to make the companies responsible for the systems they've created and the harm that they've caused, and regulate them like other industries are regulated. The impact on individuals who've been exposed to disinformation, hate speech, radicalization over a long period of time, that may be a longer struggle, even with the best regulation in place. I think I agree with Kyle's circle, but I think there's also, there can also be a line as well, which is kind of, do you believe in the state or do you not? Do you believe in our institutions, in our society? Do you believe we have obligations to each other, or do you not believe in that anymore? And I think a lot of the harm that's been done is putting people in a place where they just simply don't know what to believe anymore. And you look at weaker democracies, weaker countries, and then that is replaced then with an absolute faith in the state. That you don't know who to believe, you don't know which experts to believe, so you just believe in the state, and the system is manipulated and designed to promote that view. And if we look around the world today, we see rising levels of crime against women, rising levels of racially motivated crimes, rising levels of teenagers self-harming, and a retreat of democracy. And I think there's a big overlap with those trends emerging, and that is the growing domination of social media as people's principal source of news and information. And I don't think it's a coincidence.
Thank you all so much. Thank you to Byline Times and also to the Frontline Club, and for your wonderful film as well, Kat, and all of you who've been involved. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Marianne.
That's right.
One